Thanks, Amy, and thanks everybody for coming out and seeing how many people are standing. I'll talk really fast. So the topic tonight is about cities and towns in Oregon, and Portland may be the largest city in Oregon, but it's had plenty of competition. As steamboats and then railroads tie the Pacific Northwest into the national economy, cities in different corners of Oregon experience booming growth. So we're starting with Portland. We're not going to stay here. We'll be visiting cities and towns as far apart as Astoria, Klamath Falls, and Baker City, as we trace the development of a statewide system of cities and towns. And that's just a second title slide, so give you something to look at. So while you're thinking about a map of North America from about 1800, what you'd see then is a string of very small cities along the Atlantic coast from Quebec and Montreal around to New Orleans, with Boston and New York and Philadelphia and Charleston in between. None of them bigger than present-day McMinnville or Roseburg. There are also a scattering of tiny forts and settlements like Detroit, St. Louis, and San Antonio that nobody would yet call a city. Everything else on that map is a blank, at least a devoid of places where European languages were commonly spoken. A century later, the map is different, showing a continent teeming with cities large, middling, and small but aspiring. A few of them had already gotten their start by George Washington's time, but most of them were new. Chicago, Cleveland, Atlanta, Minneapolis, Denver, Sacramento, not to mention Pendleton, Prineville, Pilot Rock, and Portland. So 4 themes are going to weave through my talk. First, every Oregon city started as a little speck of settlement, a few crude buildings along a rough street of dust or mud, hopefully with a, quote, hotel, unquote, and a post office address. Some grew a bit and plateaued as small towns. Some flourished briefly and faded away. A few developed in substantial metropolitan areas. So we've seen the winner. We've seen a town that's not quite as large. This is as far northeast in Oregon as you can get and find a town. Second, the determinants of growth were pluck and luck. That means leadership. Pluck stands for leadership, for entrepreneurial efforts of civic leaders, business people, and investors to capitalize on geographic advantages. Luck means the advantages of geography. Location, location, and location. The advantages of particularly having a position on a river, very, very important, especially the first section of stuff I'm going to talk about. So pluck and luck, combination of natural advantages and energetic development. Third, it's all about transportation, particularly about steam power, harnessing the energy of steam to turn paddle wheels, to power screws on larger ships, to power locomotive drive wheels. And fourth, Portland has been the dominant city in Oregon since the 1850s, but the rest of the urban system has been continual flux down to the present. A wide variety of places have competed for top finishes in any given census year, some surging up the ladder, some falling back, a bit like football or basketball teams in weekly rankings. So these are the towns that have made at one time or another, in one census year or another, one of the top 5. And if we move a little bit further, we add a few more that have made the top 10. I grouped these into ones that are relatively freestanding, ones that have been absorbed, that were independent cities and have been absorbed into Portland, and those that are part of the Portland metropolitan area. although at their founding would have been considered themselves, and of course still do, very independent and separate from Portland. So in the next hour or so, I'm going to trace the rise of 3 types of Oregon towns and cities, then ask a big question about Portland. So this is the preview of our coming attractions. Rivers. Rivers controlled the fate of Oregon's first cities. For much of the 19th century, boats and ships were the most efficient way and often the only way to get from one part of the Northwest to another. Cities that grew in early Oregon were places that were positioned to take advantage of river transportation and river resources. And obviously, there's a key choke point here. You have the Great Columbia Basin, you have the smaller but very fertile Willamette Valley. This is really a very, very strategic location, made obvious here. The place through which, in the era of particularly water transportation, all the trade of the Columbia Basin would flow past and through. So in 1850, everybody believed that an important city would develop somewhere along the lower Willamette or Columbia. Nobody could be certain exactly where it would be. Portland was a plausible candidate, but success was far from assured. The California gold rush had created a market for Oregon products shipped through Portland, but the gold rush also siphoned off a lot of residents. 2 generations of Portland promoters, Overton and Lovejoy, Pettygrove and Stark, had already basically given up on Portland to seek greener pastures. And half a dozen rival settlements along a 50-mile stretch of the lower Willamette and Columbia offered serious competition. Fortunes changed fast on the frontier. Would Portland or Milwaukee be the metropolis of Oregon? St. John's or St. Helens or some site still unnamed? You can see here on the map this stretch of possible competitors from Oregon City, Milwaukee, Portland, St. John's, Linton, down to St. Helens. And the ostensible issue for Oregonians in 1850 was the location at the head of navigation, the point of furthest access by ocean shipping to the agricultural riches of the Willamette Valley. Now, as every sailor knew, there was actually no single definitive point. The head of navigation varied with the season, the length of the wharf, the type of the ship, the foolishness of the captain. Many towns could legitimately claim some part of the title. The real question, I think, was which town had the most push, which is kind of the entrepreneurial enterprise, boosterism, ambition, the pioneer spirit, if you will. Portland eventually took the prize because it acquired 3 essentials that assured the town's growth, started all at the beginning of the 1850s. A newspaper to promote the town, a usable connection to Washington County, and dependable steamship service to the larger world. Now, newspaper on the 19th century frontier was an urban identification card. Even a 4-page weekly was proof that a town site was a going concern. It rankled and grated the Portland leadership in early 1850 that they had to advertise their wares in the Oregon City Spectator. William Chapman and Stephen Coffin remedied the situation by recruiting an unemployed editor from San Francisco, along with his battered hand printing press. Thomas Jefferson Dreyer issued the first number of the Oregonian on December 4th, 1850. For the next 10 years, he advocated first the Whig Party and then the Republican Party, promoted Portland, and used every printable insult infused with Salem's Oregon statesman, and some unprintable, I suspect. So if the Oregonian gave Portland equal standing with, you can see from this picture, he does look a little irascible. If the Oregonian gave Portland equal standing with Oregon City as an information center for the territory, then a few miles of unfinished plank road were enough for victory over the nearest rivals. At the start of the 1850s, Americans throughout The Midwest, the South, and the far West were seized by mania for plank roads, highways with a surface of sawed planks spiked to wooden stringers. This shows you how to build one. The book is by a leading Hoosier intellectual and businessman. It's really, in fact, kind of appalling to think about how much wonderful lumber was sawed up and stuck on the ground to rot in about 5 years because people thought plank roads were the thing. As soon as railroads really took off, plank roads went away. But the story, of course, for Portland is our own plank road, chartered by the legislature in January of 1851, the Portland and Valley Plank Road Company. Organizational meeting was held in Lafayette, but Portland's big three of Daniel Lansdale and Coffin and Chapman signed up to buy a third of the stock. Construction started from Portland, up the ravine of Tanner Creek, over the Sylvan Hill and on toward Hillsborough. The first planks from Portland's own sawmill went down with great fanfare on September 27, 1851. Now, the company ran out of money soon after planking, with only a few miles were done. But this first version of Canyon Road was the most accessible, easiest way, even in its primitive state, for Washington County farmers to get produce to the Willamette River. It was a coup. Portlanders were the winner in the plank road competition. The losers were people who'd staked their hopes on places like Linton and St. John's. Now, Milwaukee is a bigger challenge. It's a town founded by Lot Whitcomb in 1848. He published the Western Star newspaper, whose first issue went to press 2 weeks before the Oregonian. So Milwaukee has a jump on Portland. So it could, it wouldn't have taken much for that to be the center and downtown Portland to be kind of, like the burbs. Let's get a little Milwaukee here. He also built a steamboat, which he modestly called the Lot Whitcomb of Oregon. It began a regular run to Astoria in February of 1851, top speed of 14 miles an hour. It was also painfully expensive to operate. By June, he was forced to sell out his namesake boat to a syndicate who operated it from Portland, either to Astoria or to Oregon City. You can see, reading this ad, arranged the sailing schedule from Portland to Astoria to Oregon City, and this wonderful piece of poetry celebrating the vessel. I'll let you read it yourself. I'd be a little embarrassed to actually recite it. So Milwaukee was a good place to load lumber. It was isolated and inconvenient for Washington County wheat growers, the wrong side of the river, right? And also, the river gets shallower as it gets closer to the falls. Boats trying to call at Milwaukee began to scrape on sandbars, especially the Ross Island sandbar. Captain John H. Couch, who I will show you there, looking businesslike. Captain John Couch, who had recently made Portland his base of operations, announced to the public that the river at Ross Island ordinarily had only about 4 feet of water, and he claimed also to have ridden his horse across the Willamette, right, from one side to the other at Ross Island. So obviously, Milwaukee had some problems. And you can see a little bit of this. This is a map compiled from the land surveys, done in 1852. You can see Ross Island, Portland town site up there. You can see how before heavy dredging, this would be in fact a pretty treacherous way to get past this, to try to get down to Milwaukee. So Portland, Ross Island, you could say Ross Island gets a lot of credit for Portland's, triumph. And finally, Portland had to fight the battle with biggest rival, which was St. Helens. To quote historian Eugene Snyder, one battle was fought over the wagons, the other battle was for the ships. St. Helenites built a road over Cornelius Pass, but Portland had countered with its Canyon Road. In 1852, the Pacific Mail Steamship Company announced that its California to Oregon service would terminate at St. Helens. The company was concerned about the sandbar at Swan Island, and generally thought, just another view of the river with the north end of Ross Island. So you can see things weren't quite as neat and tidy as they are today. Then just so St. Helens. You can see why folks might say, thinking about shipping, wouldn't it be nicer to stop here and not have to get through all this stuff here and all the way down here past Swan Island? And which channel do you take, the Multnomah Channel or this channel? And it's just a hell of a lot simpler to stop there. That's what people in California thought. It turned out that the cargoes were at Portland. St. Helens might be a logical site just in thinking about just purely looking at the map. But Portland had the cargoes, and the California Shipping Company decided after 2 years it would come to Portland and not stop at St. Helens. But again, it's a relatively close thing. It wouldn't have taken much for St. Helens to have ended up being kind of the metropolis of the lower rivers, and Portland would be kind of like, Estacada, I suppose, in relation to the big city. Didn't happen that way, but coming close. So from Portland itself, I want to shift our gaze. Especially in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, riverboats ruled Oregon. Feeding Portland's economy were Willamette River steamboat towns. The first steamboats began to chug along the upper Willamette in 1851. Business boomed with completion of the Klamath Falls locks in 1873. Steamers reached upstream to Albany, Corvallis, Harrisburg, and even Eugene, depending on, the depth of the water, time of the season, time of the year. They picked up produce that farmers laboriously hauled to landings. Riverboats also served Dayton along the saffron-colored Yamhill River, and after river improvements in 1900, even reached up to Lafayette and McMinnville. In 1870, 6 of the 7 largest towns in Oregon hugged riverbanks. So we got Salem. This is clearly a festive occasion because you will note that there's a brass band up here. So this is not not normally serenading some farmers unloading their wagons. And feeding the river trade, there are also a series of what I call upland towns arrayed north-south along roads that were far enough away from the river's sinuous course and wide bordering wetlands so as not to sink constantly into the muck. Places like Lebanon, Staten, and Silverton on one side of the valley, Monmouth, Dalles, Independence, and Amity on the other side. So river towns, upland towns in the valley that fed down to the rivers, and the steamboat trade persisted into the 20th century, but under increasingly stiff competition from railroads after the 1880s, and increasing difficulty in keeping the river navigable. As farmers cleared more land, there's more silt that chokes the river. As there's more logging, there are more snags that wash into the river to kill your steamboat. Vessels sometimes found it a major challenge even to turn around in the Yamhill River. And for example, the Corps of Engineers gave up in 1904 trying to maintain a channel to Eugene, leaving it high and dry, and leaving Harrisburg as the head of navigation for at least a few years. Now, the Columbia River, we've done the Willamette, can't leave out the Columbia. Equally vital to Portland. Mining strikes in the interior, Idaho, Montana, the interior of the Columbia River Basin in the 1860s, gave Portland a second boost as a supply base and jumping off point during these frantic boom years. More than 15,000 people passed upriver through Portland in 1861, more than 20,000 in 1862, 1863. The Oregonian reported gleefully that rents are up to an exorbitant figure. Many houses contain 2 or more families, and the hotels and boarding houses are crowded almost to overflowing. The town is full of people. Buildings are going up. Wharves are stretching their proportions along the levees, and a general thrift and busy hum greet the ears. Now, Portland monopolized the growing business because of geography and because of the Oregon Steam Navigation Company, Oregon's first millionaire-making machine. The company's leading figure was John C. Ainsworth, former Mississippi River steamboat captain who united the businesses that operated segments of the Columbia River route. And the corporation controlled improvements at 2 navigation bottlenecks, operating a railroad to carry traffic around the rapids at what's now the town of Cascade Locks, and a 14-mile road and then railroad to bypass the long stretch of falls and rapids around the Dalles. Oh, what did I do? Wrong one. Did I hit the off button? Or blank button? Nope.
Click next.
Next. Oh, what about that? Did I hit that? Did I hit that? There, bingo. I hit the wrong button. There we have, a steamboat, one of the boats that operated between the Cascades and the Dalles. So you had 3 different stretches for the shipping with those 2 portages in between, and the portage railroad around at the Dalles. And film buffs may know that the Columbia River trade made a Hollywood appearance in a 1952 film, Bend of the River, with Jimmy Stewart and Rock Hudson. And the stern wheel tug Portland, still moored along the Portland waterfront, played the part of the presumably historic steamboat. It's Beyond the Bend of the River in Italian and Distant Horizons in Spanish. And they start in Portland, they take the steamboat up the river, and then they end up kind of circling around Mount Hood. It's kind of like the scenic loop tour. So here's Portland, 1889. The heart of the city. We're looking south, of course. So Ross Island. The Albany rail yards, the Union Pacific Smokestack, which is going to appear again in another slide, my favorite Portland landmark. So Albina, East Portland, Slab Town. You can see the normal normal Portland blocks and the double blocks in Northwest. Industrial on the river, busy harbor, a prosperous, growing city, and in a phrase that I did not coin, the city that gravity built. Again, the flow of the rivers. The Columbia River also accounted for Portland's greatest 19th century rival. That is before upstart Seattle kind of elbowed in. That's Astoria. So Portland, Astoria, in the same year. It was the alternative front door, an ocean port and manufacturing powerhouse with lumber mills and salmon canneries lining the waterfront, and population reflected Astoria's importance. It was, for many years, either the number 2 or the number 3 city in terms of population in the state of Oregon. It was really an important place. You can see some of the activity along the waterfront. Tonnage passing through the port of Astoria as late as 1922 was basically half that of the Portland total, so really an important shipping point. And it was an ethnic mixing bowl with Chinese, Finnish, Norwegian, Swedish fishers, loggers, factory workers, active labor politics, distinct immigrant neighborhoods, and a real urban feel to Astoria. I seem to have something for brass bands. I do, actually. And downtown Astoria bears the clear evidence of its turn-of-the-century prominence. The streetscape in downtown Astoria that embodies the 1910s and 20s and is capped by 1924's Hotel Astoria with its 8 stories and its neo-Gothic facade. Another little sense, real estate ambitions. This is all the land you wanted to buy in the greater Astoria area. The city itself, we're going off to the Pacific here. So take your choice. Many opportunities to make a fortune and assist the Astoria Land Company. And despite its success, Astoria has always had to cope with a serious problem of location. It was eventually, now is served by a single rail line rather than Portland's multiple lines, and counterintuitively, it's too close to the ocean, violating the principle that it's nearly always most efficient to carry goods by water as far as possible, which is why you have had the growth of historic river ports like London, Hamburg, Bordeaux, Guangzhou, New Orleans, and of course, Portland. This map gives you a sense, I think, of the way in which Astoria kind of dangles out here at the end. So people sometimes wonder, why don't port activities move down to Astoria? There are a whole bunch of good reasons, but basically, you want it, it's too far from the action. Now, shifting gears, quite literally, cities the railroads made. We've talked about cities the rivers made, not the cities that the railroads made. Steamboats, fishing boats, and lumber schooners were keys to the urban network in wet Oregon, but it took railroads to cement the economy of the Willamette Valley and to bring major urban development to dry eastern Oregon. Entrepreneurs, sometimes careful, sometimes overambitious, built Oregon's rail network between 1869 and roughly 1910, a little bit after that. Roughly a 40-year span to fill in most of the network. I don't want to rehearse the whole story of the Oregon and California Railroad, the rival lines that started southward on each side of the Willamette, upstart Ben Holliday's success in skunking the Portland establishment, and his failure to make the east side of the city into a new business center, although it's still kind of slowly plugging along in that direction. The arrival of Henry Villard, the completion of the ONC to California in 1887. That's all, that could be another 15-minute story, but it's not. What's important is that railroad building south from Portland confirmed the city's dominance within Oregon. Rail supplemented and then supplanted Willamette River steamers, in effect coming just in time to save Portland's Willamette Valley trade. The second part of the story is Portland's acquisition of transcontinental rail connections. Henry Villard, in 1879, bought out the Oregon Steam Navigation Company, formed a new Oregon Railway Navigation Company, and 2 years later came his greatest coup. He raised money from investors, gained control of the Northern Pacific Railroad, made himself transportation king of the Northwest. The Portland Hotel, he ran out of money before he finished it, so other folks, it stayed half built for several years, and other folks actually finished it. And the pamphlet simply says in German, the completion of the Northern Pacific Railroad, to convince German investors that it had really happened. The main line of the Northern Pacific is finished in 1883, and Villard marked the accomplishment by hauling dignitaries from the east to a gold spike ceremony at Deer Lodge, Montana. Diplomats, New York bankers, German financiers, congressmen, governors, and former President Ulysses S. Grant all watched driving the golden spike, which is actually steel, late in the afternoon of September 8, 1883. And then the whole party steamed westward. Steamed westward in a rolling celebration, I suspect was well lubricated. They steamed through the Dalles, up there, and then into Portland on September 10th. And on September 11th, there was a big parade. It started at 4th and Hall, went north to Burnside, ended up at the Mechanics Pavilion, where the Keller Auditorium is now located, and everybody gave speeches. Of course, that's what you did in the 1880s. Everybody gave speeches, and the Board of Trade President Donald McClay expressed the reason for the excitement in one sentence: "We are now connected with the rest of the world." The corporate peace treaty had already given the Union Pacific access to Portland over Northern Pacific tracks, and the Northern Pacific reciprocal use of the UP tracks into Utah. And when a Union Pacific branch touched the Northern Pacific branch in Baker County in 1884, Portland had the advantage of two different transcontinental routes that its business people could make use of. And the next slides show the expansion of Oregon's rail system. And note the importance of the 1880s. A little bit in 1874, a bit more by 1881, boom, 1884, connections expand. By 1900, it's, the two key transportation corridors we now think of as interstate highway corridors were defined by, key railroads. Portland was not, even with these railroads, a major transportation hub in the national sense. This map shows where in the western states where the real rail hubs were. They're El Paso, Denver, Salt Lake City, and Spokane. If you were in Boise in 1910, you had to go through Washington, Spokane to get to northern Idaho, which raises the question of shouldn't we redraw state boundaries in the Northwest, but I leave that for the discussion period. So Portland is kind of a secondary node, a little bit like we are in the air transportation system now. Stuff's, feeder lines come in here, but we're not a major, hub city for air traffic. In the same way, we weren't a major hub for rail traffic. Now, outside of Portland and the Willamette Valley, railroad building allowed the exploitation of previously isolated regions rich in timber, tillable soils, and minerals, and with these waves of development, the emergence of regional cities that served the needs of large chunks of eastern and southern Oregon. The urban boom bounced around the state. So you can see Baker City had its decade, Pendleton had its decade, Medford, K Falls, Bend. These are the decades of the most rapid growth, kind of where they jumped several notches, kind of the urban, league tables. And again, you can see here railroads continuing in the 20th century, filling in by 1911. We're going to talk about the Deschutes line in a second, filling in, spur and branch lines, and then finally by 1930, filling in a couple more connections here, sort of finalizing the main trackage. Although total mileage by 1930 is beginning to decline. So Baker City, again, surged from 7th to 3rd largest city in Oregon between 1880 and 1920. Pendleton followed by jumping from 9th to 4th place in the 1890s. So you have in kind of that core segment of Oregon, kind of the Baker City or Pendleton, which is going to be the dominant city. Here we have Pendleton. The bird's eye view on the hills up there at the top, you probably can't read it. It reads, high rolling tablelands, famous wheat fields of Umatilla County. And we have Pendleton Woolen Mills and cargoes of wheat, wagon loads of wheat being brought into town. So Pendleton is an agricultural center. And, Pendleton obviously began to stage its roundup in 1910, a great publicity idea to get your kind of known as beyond kind of the narrow confines of, one corner of Oregon. Baker, however, erected the tallest building in eastern Oregon, the Baker Community Hotel, which was completed in 1929, was for 1 year the tallest building between Portland and Salt Lake City, until Boise caught up a year later. But for 1 year, Baker City is kind of the metropolis of the middle. And you can get a sense of the structure of the local community in a city like Baker by looking at the fraternal society buildings erected downtown. The Masonic Lodge from 1900, the Pythian Castle for the Knights of Pythias, 1907, the Oddfellows Building, 1907. Again, it's great fun to go to Oregon towns and look for those buildings. Try to find the Oddfellows Building Hall, try to find the Masonic Temple, and you certainly can. Other jumps, Medford, from 15th to 5th in the first decade of the 20th century, shooting from about 2,000 people to mostly almost 9,000 people. K Falls went from about 5,000 residents in 1920 to 16,000 in 1930, vaulted from 14th place to 4th place. Quite a leap. There are also cities like Coos Bay that grew steadily but without such impressive leaps. In fact, Coos Bay, North Bend, would post the biggest relative gains during the Great Oregon timber boom of the 1940s, 1950s. So let's look at the process in a little bit more detail in north central Oregon. The Dalles. Dalles had already grown into an important town in the Oregon steam navigation days, as what geographers call a break of bulk point, where goods have to be shifted from one type of conveyance to another. Until Canal was opened in 1915, Lower Columbia River and Upper Columbia River steamers were connected first by the wagon road and then by the railroad that we saw. And that, necessary for kind of a river portage city, it gave the Dalles its start. It's exactly what gave Louisville, Kentucky its start. Exactly that same function on the Ohio River. They have a bigger horse race. The Transcontinental Railroad, added to the city's importance, was Oregon's 4th largest city in 1880, still its 6th largest in 1900. And what came next was further expansion of railroads south from the Columbia. Here's the Dalles in the early 20th century and a description of the Dalles from H.L. Davis's great Pulitzer Prize novel, Honey in the Horn. Times were livening up in the Columbia River towns that fall because the upper country was getting not one railroad, but two. And old E.H. Harriman and James J. Hill were outletting contracts, buying rights of way, and banging out court injunctions back and forth. Men were already piling into the Middle River ports beyond hand when work opened. Every side hill freight station in the upper country was petitioning to be the county seat of a new county. The windows of real estate offices were loaded with maps of Gainesville and Wilkinsburg and Petersonville, Cherryvale and Apple Heights and Gooseberry Villas and Sweet Pea home sites, all right in the path of future development, and all requiring only the investment of a little small change to make a man a capitalist for life. There was a carnival on all of the streets, and deckhands and cowboys and shovel stiffs and real estate promoters elbowed their way around under the arc lights and mobs of street show pitchmen and girls on the prowl picking at their flanks. It's a great book. So the reference to Hill and Harriman is a reference to the two great railroad tycoons of the early 20th century, who each decided in 1909 to build a railroad up the Deschutes River. Hill had just completed the North Bank line along the Columbia, now part of the Burlington Northern Santa Fe system, and Harriman controlled the Union Pacific on the south side. Hill picked the west side of the Deschutes, Harriman the east side, and so began a couple frantic years as crews raced each other to grade right-of-way and lay track. Until Harriman died, and his successor decided there was more money to be made by cooperation. The two efforts combined operations, shifting the tracks from one side of the river to the other, as topography suggested. The new town reached the struggling town of Bend. So there's the route. And it did, indeed, it did open up Central Oregon. Reached the struggling town of Bend in 1911, shown here before recreationists, skiers, Californians, etc. Hill told the Bend audience, "There is no reason why Central Oregon should not produce enormous wealth. We have a good deal of faith in it. If we did not, we would not have come here." He was a hard-headed businessman. Other investors agreed, building the huge Shevlin Hickson and Brooks Scanlon mills turned Central Oregon trees into lumber for world markets, shooting Bend to 12th place among Oregon cities in 1910, 7th place by the 1930s. So river cities, railroad cities, and then we're going to kind of work our way down what I call the kind of the urban hierarchy, the urban system. Because not every important, interesting Oregon town is a Portland or an Astoria or even a Baker City. Railroads not only created regional capitals, they filled in the network of smaller towns that exist in a kind of symbiotic relationship with larger centers. So especially in rural, sparsely settled areas like Oregon, cities and towns tend to sort into a hierarchy. The biggest city has the most complex economy, the most services, and the largest hinterland. Under its wing, so to speak, are smaller regional cities with simpler economies and smaller hinterlands that nest within the larger. And clustered under these regional centers are still smaller communities with shorter economic reach, and you get the picture. Down the hierarchy, down to county crossroads, where there might be a gas station, grocery combo, maybe a post office, or before Netflix, a place to rent videos. So at the third level in the Oregon system, smaller than Portland or regional centers like Astoria and Medford, but way bigger than country crossroads, are county seats that grew to respectable size, never cracked the state's top 10. So I'm thinking of places like Enterprise, with its imposing Wallowa County Courthouse, busy Main Street here from the 1920s or 30s, Grants Pass, here pictured as in the famous Rogue River Valley. That's what it says down there at the bottom. Or, looking a little dustier, Prineville about 1915. This is after it had been bypassed by the railroad that went to Bend instead of Prineville. And a couple of years before, Crook County voters taxed themselves to build a railroad spur to connect Prineville to the main north-south railroad. And a few more hills and canyons away from Prineville. Heppner. Heppner benefited from a spur line railroad that pushed south from the Columbia River as early as the late 1880s. It briefly cracked the top 25, never the top 10, but the top 25 in 1900 before dropping back. The flood of 1903 certainly didn't help. A century later, it's a solid fourth-level town. I call it a fourth-level town with perhaps Oregon's, I think, most attractive county courthouse. And unfortunately, the Wagon Wheel Cafe has closed since I took this picture. Either a roundup room or a wagon wheel cafe is to be found in many, 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 many western towns. And then, one more Hepner image. This is an important one. What happened? Did I get out of order? Yes. Sorry about that. What's that? Les Schwab. I have a kind of metric. Is a town big enough for Les Schwab? Anybody in the Northwest knows exactly what that means. Enterprise, Burns, John Day, Ontario, LeGrand, Milton, Freewater, or other Oregon towns that fit the same category. A couple thousand people, lots and lots of landscape around it, and a Les Schwab dealer. It's just, I think, a great metric. And then there are towns that are even too small for Les Schwab, anchoring the base of an urban pyramid with its apex at Portland. So at the same time that construction group gangs were dynamiting their way along the Deschutes, other entrepreneurs built a railroad southward up the Hood River Valley, which is why I got this slide out of order. Now, of course, just scenic, tourist entertainment, railroad. But the railroad from Hood River reached Odell and D in 1906, Parkdale in 1909. Now, did this 21-mile railroad make Hood River as big as the Dalles? Well, no. Did it make Odell or Parkdale into another Bend? No, of course not. Did it support a miniature urban system serving the needs of orchardists and loggers within the county? Absolutely. So Parkdale, we're back in Hepner. We'll leap to Parkdale. Parkdale, for example, the railroad got there basically got to that site in 1909. The town was founded in 1910. McIsaac's store also dates from the same year, still going strong. Now serves not only 250 local residents, but families on fruit buying expeditions and tourists on the old railroad. If not for Mount Hood in the way, Baseline Road, extending eastward there and westward there, if not for Mount Hood getting in the way, that would connect right up to Stark Street as the baseline for the original land survey, the 1850s. Finally, especially you guys standing up there, finally. We have to have some culture first. In the first act of Shakespeare's drama Julius Caesar, Cassius complains eloquently to Brutus about Caesar's growing power. Why, man, he doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus, and we petty men walk under his huge legs and peep about to find ourselves dishonorable graves. Well, that's the complaint that a lot of people in other parts of the state make about Portland. The colossus that bestrides the state, that dominates, controls, economic weight, cultural arrogance of the metropolis overpowering the rest of the state. So I want to conclude by asking a question. Have there been trends in Portland's preeminence? Is the metro area more dominant now than ever? Well, the answer, there's a little bit of social science here you'll have to put up with. They're like 3 graphs, but they're easy ones. I looked at numbers and concluded that, in fact, Portland's greatest relative dominance was in the late 19th century, not the early 21st century. In fact, its relative weight has been declining with the steady maturing of the Oregon system of cities. So these 3 roughly equal periods, Portland starts in front and widens its lead, an era kind of equilibrium, the middle decades of the 20th century, and a recent era in which we find a paradox, an urban system that's far more balanced than a century ago, but with the social and cultural influence of the metropolis perhaps greater than ever before. So populations, the top 5 cities in Oregon in 1880, 1920, these are the years when Portland outdistanced the rest of Oregon. In the 1860s, Portland had a lead, but places like Salem, Astoria, and Oregon City could still hold ambitions to catch up or even pass Portland. By 1880, it was clear that there was one dominant city. See that Portland is far, far ahead of Astoria in population. And 1920, Salem pushed up to second place, and Portland is still, it's about 15 times larger, 14 times larger. A huge, huge margin. Portland's the primary port of the Pacific Northwest in this period, major manufacturing center, produced flour and preserved meat and lumber and building products and wooden ships and swimsuits and all kinds of stuff, not wooden ones. So this represents Portland at the turn of the century. I promised you the Union Pacific smokestack again. There it is. This is Harvey Scott standing in bronze plenitude on the top of Mount Tabor and looking the wrong direction. You'd think if you're kind of looking toward the future, you're supposed to look west, especially if you're on the west coast. It's like, but he's looking back toward Trout, actually more toward Boring, I think, kind of southeastish. That represents his solid conservatism. Harvey Scott, who edited the Oregonian for decades, didn't believe in things like votes for women, which we all know he didn't believe in. He didn't believe in public high schools, just a frivolity. If you needed more education than sixth grade, you should pay for it yourself. And don't even get him started on labor unions, that kind of stuff. So business-like conservative place. And Portland was also the financial capital for most of Oregon and much of Idaho and Washington. Banks across the United States in 1913 voted for their preferred city for the West Coast branch of the new Federal Reserve banking system. And this was the vote from Oregon and Washington. Portland was more popular in this region than Seattle and than Spokane. Presumably those traders picking San Francisco were in Southern Oregon. Of course, San Francisco got it, but there are a lot of Californians. So in 1920, 1 out of 3 Oregonians lived in Portland, a figure unmatched before or since. Its population was twice as great as the next 20 cities combined. A little bit more. This is just more of the kind of the prosperity of Portland in the early 20th century. It was Oregon's primate city. It's a term that geographers sometimes use for a city that far outstrips its competitors in region or nation. In some cases, it may be a political capital like Paris that has overwhelmed provincial rivals. In other places, it may be the center through which European imperial power dominated colonial possessions, concentrated governmental authority and commerce in a place like Manila. So Portland is a primate city, and since this is a kind of settlement frontier, think of it as the Buenos Aires of Oregon. And there is a little kind of a tango center at Reed College. Another way to measure Portland's prominence is to test the rank size model. This is where it gets a little bit nerdy, but it won't be long. In large, mature nations like Germany, China, or the United States as a whole, urban systems often follow a pattern in which the second largest city is roughly half the size of the largest, the third is 1/3 of the largest, 1/4, 1/5. Okay, again, you get the idea. In contrast, early Oregon is distinctly unbalanced. The second largest city in 1880, Astoria, was 1/7 as large as Portland. Salem was 1/8 as large, and 4 decades later, the imbalance was even deeper. Salem was 1/16 the size of Portland. Again, I was guessing 1/14. Astoria 1/18, etc. Eugene was 1/24. So this represents what the situation graphically. This is Portland population in 1920. The maroon line is what the population of the other cities would be if the rank size rule applied. The blue is what really the actual Oregon situation. Way, way, way unbalanced. So the second period, from 1920 to 1970, when the river and rail transportation systems were largely in place, when Oregon had a relatively stable economy based on producing and processing natural resources, the gap between Portland and the rest of the state stabilizes and then slowly narrows. You can, again, compare populations 1940, 1960. You can see that, for example, Eugene is beginning to catch up a bit. Even Salem is beginning to catch up again. And this is Portland's quiet period. Growing slowly, except for the aberration of World War II, growing slowly, moving cautiously. One journalist in the 1930s commented that the way to know what Portland would do in any given situation was to ask what Calvin Coolidge would do. As an important Oregon writer commented, Portland presents a civic character of complexities. Though many of its leading men have wanted the place to become another New York or Chicago, just as many others have been quite content with the status of the moment, whether that moment was 1850, 1900, or 1950. And journalist Neil Pierce wrote a lot about urban affairs. What did he say? He said, if any West Coast town could be said to have a monopoly on propriety and an anxiousness to keep things as they are, it is Portland, a town of quiet wealth, discreet culture, that's us, and cautious politics. When did he say it? In 1970. Just at the time things were beginning to change. If he'd said it in 1960, it would have been pretty accurate. By 1975, it had been totally off base. But you can see this sense of Portland as an unexciting, dare I say, stodgy place in the post-war generation, pretty widely held. So I've used this example before, but I think it's a good one. So the two Northwest rivals. There's, of course, that city, which gets that thing. And then there's the other city that gets this. So finally, Oregon's begun to catch up with Portland since 1970. Well, Portland's continued to grow and prosper and, of course, get, I think, more interesting. So have cities where education and recreation were prominent economic drivers. Not only the obvious example of Eugene, but also Corvallis, Albany, and Bend, which have grown large enough to earn formal recognition as metropolitan areas. So, metropolitan populations, can see Oregon catching up by the numbers. Portland is less dominant now than it was a century ago. In 1920, remember, Portland was twice as large as the next 20 cities combined, then twice as large as the next 12 cities, and then as large as the next 2.4. The gap is rapidly shrinking, rapidly narrowing. And back to that graph again. Rising up, getting close. You're still way away from this idealized model, which very few places actually quite match, but getting a lot closer, and you can see it because now the blue is the model, and the whatever this color is, tannish, whatever it is 1920, and the maroon is 2000. So you can see the gap is narrowed. We're getting closer to the pattern. So my unexpected conclusion is that Oregon's system of cities is far more equally balanced than it was a century ago. We're still doing the same. Portland's still doing the same things for the state: transportation, wholesale distribution, health and education, banking, business services, many other cities are catching up by reorienting themselves to the 21st century economy. Metropolitan territory covers more and more of the Oregon map. The brightish blue is official metropolitan areas. The light blue is something that the Census Bureau has recently started to define called micropolitan areas, which is kind of odd, but it's for smaller cities that still seem to be the center of, kind of regional centers. So, Pendleton, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a little odd, but an awful lot of the state is now, by kind of official government statistics, kind of tiled in these metropolitan or micropolitan colors. And I think we're getting a new twist on the old story of city and hinterland. Portland and Salem and Eugene and Corvallis are exporting metropolitan culture along with retirees and recreationists. A metropolitan weekend land extends from Newport to Bend to Hood River and back to Astoria. This is an official federal map defining by the Federal Economic Research Service of the USDA, defining what they called recreation counties, where a very high percentage of income came from recreation business. At this point was non-metropolitan recreation counties. At that point, Deschutes County was, Bend was non-metropolitan, so they would knock this out now. But you can see, the coast, Central Oregon. I call this the kind of the weekend corner of the state, from the Portland point of view, of course. So weekly visitation, telecommuting, recreation industries, these help to attract migrants directly from out-of-state metropolitan areas, also to places like Hood River, further urbanizing local culture. So just in Hood River, for example, an old cold storage warehouse for fruit now houses the U.S. Forest Service offices for the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area. Oak Street in Hood River is still a bustling main street, but the shops are different. The former J.C. Penney store morphed into a sporting goods store. So did France Hardware. There's a fine hardware mural still on the side of the building, but inside are skis and camping equipment. I grabbed a couple bargains, the closeout sale at Mars for Men on Oak Street before the space was taken over, if I recall, by a camera store. And the Paris Fair department store has given way to, which was a clothing store, given way to an upscale Italian restaurant and a computer store taking orders for smartphones. So it is indeed, new wine in the old building, if not bottle. So finally, what stayed the same? Portland's basic services for the state, and obviously Portland is still the most prominent in the dominant city. What's changing? Oregon's system of cities is far more equally balanced than it was a century ago. And what's changing as well? Metropolitan influences are reshaping even the most distant corners of the state. And with that, it's your turn.